Welcome back to the Business of Biotech. I'm your host, Ben Comer, Chief Editor at Life Science Leader, and today I'm speaking with Cindy Perettie, Executive Vice President and Global Head at Kite Pharma, a Gilead company focused on developing and commercializing curative CAR T-cell therapies for cancer patients. Cindy is an experienced leader with a background including cancer research and life science industry leadership positions at Genentech, Roche, and Foundation Medicine. I'm excited to speak with Cindy about developing, scaling, and commercializing curative cell therapies at Kite, her approach to partnerships and collaborations, what she's learned from previous industry experiences, and what the future holds for cell therapy funding and product development. Thank you so much for being here, Cindy.
Thank you, Ben. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad to speak with you as well. I think Kite's a really fascinating organization and company. But I want to start out with a little bit on your background, Cindy. You began your career, I think, as a research associate at Johns Hopkins. And then, as I mentioned in the intro, went on to work for some of the biggest names in biotech, Genentech, and then Roche, where you worked as head of global oncology strategy. And then later as head of Roche Molecular Lab Solutions. You were also CEO at Foundation Medicine. What can you tell me, Cindy, about your initial decision, I guess, to go from the research field into the life sciences industry?
You know, it's interesting when you're working in basic research at an academic institution, it's really exciting. You're making discoveries, but what you realize is if you want to turn those discoveries into something that's going to scale for patients, then it makes a lot of sense to join industry because industry has the ability to do all of those things, to take sort of amazing basic research and make it scale. And for me, it was about how you can have a broader impact. So it was a good decision overall.
What drew you to oncology in particular?
You know, early in life, I lost my grandfather to cancer. And when I started doing research, there was a lot of interesting, it was at a time where new genes were being found as it related to cancer. And so your ability to do targeted treatments versus sort of general chemotherapy was just coming to the forefront. And so it was an exciting time. And I think that's what drew me on professional side.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm also curious if that initial research experience that you had, and then also your time, I didn't mention this in the intro, but also the time you spent at Sarah Cannon Research Institute. Do you think that helped you as a biotech leader? And if so, how so?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we had collaborated with Sarah Cannon for many years. I was overseeing Avastin, which was an anti-VEGF product in the early days of targeted therapies. And Sarah Cannon was such a profound institution where we did a lot of our clinical trials, and they were actually the first group to move clinical trials into the community. So prior to that, you were doing them at academic centers. And it gave you a chance to really get more real life treatment experience. And so in conversations with them, they convinced me to make the leap from Genentech and join Sarah Cannon, which was probably one of the best things I had done in my career. And I would say because when I was in industry, you had this view that you were really designing trials that were patient friendly. And so I think we all drank that Kool-Aid and told ourselves every trial design we put forward, we thought about the patient deeply, and we were thinking about the care that the physician needed to give. And then when I went on the other side of it, on the Sarah Cannon side, I'll give you an example. My first couple of weeks, I was in the phase 1 clinic. In phase 1 studies, you ask patients to do 12-hour PK days, sometimes 24-hour PK days, where you're actually doing blood draws throughout the day, and the patient's sitting in the cancer center in an office essentially for that entire time, often with a family member. And so you really got a bird's eye view of what it took for the patient, what it took for the physician to administer that clinical trial. And so, years later when I left and went back to industry, I had a really different perspective on clinical trial design and how you could do it so that it was meaningful for the company, for the regulatory agencies, but also that you weren't putting a huge burden on the patients, their caregivers, the physicians.
Yeah, people don't just get cancer within 50 or 60 miles of an academic medical center.
This
The
is true.
community setting, is so important. And I wonder if that's something, we're talking about your background. We'll get to Kite, but is that
Yeah.
something that you've thought about, when not only, when it comes to clinical trial protocols and clinical trial design, but when you think about actual commercialization, is it something that
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And let's start with clinical trials on that. I'm a big fan of the community, and I realize that you can get exceptional care in the community. And I think prior to joining Sarah Cannon, I often thought that you had to go to a top-notch academic center to get that sort of care. And I can only say wonderful things about the doctors that were associated with Sarah Cannon at that time, from Tennessee Oncology, Florida Cancer Specialists, just really invested in their patients and offering clinical trials that you would, in the past have to go into an academic center to get access to. And it opened my eyes to how much opportunity there is for patients to be seen closer to home and still get that great care. And so as I move forward in my career, that's the other thing we think about a lot. And, we've got new products coming to the market. An example might be Anito-cel, where we've really thought about how do we make sure 20% of those patients in our clinical trial are actually enrolled in the community in an outpatient setting, able to go home. And it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it's something that can be overlooked, and I think it's critically important. I agree with you on that point. Are there any specific, just thinking about your background prior to Kite, Cindy, are there any specific accomplishments or maybe the biggest challenges that you would mention prior to joining Kite that kind of I guess demonstrate some of the things you've worked on, prior to joining?
Yeah, I tend to think about this. If you think about major accomplishments, no single person can do anything. It always takes a great team. And I feel really lucky that I've had the privilege to work with many great teams, whether it was at Genentech or Roche or Sarah Cannon or here at Kite Pharma. I think the idea of bringing together a group of talented individuals and then together tackling your biggest challenges and coming up with your biggest accomplishments is something that gives me a lot of pride. So if I talk about the things that, an accomplishment I'm most proud of, please know there's an amazing team behind that. And
Absolutely.
I'm going to use an example that was both an accomplishment but had big challenges. And it's something that's allowed me when I went into Foundation Medicine or Kite Pharma to think about as an example and to think about a market differently, to think about patients differently. When I was at Genentech and Roche, we developed a therapy called Hemlibra. And I'm lucky enough to work with our SVP of development here at Kite, was actually the clinician who led that development. But Hemlibra was a product that was so different than anything you'd ever seen on the market. So for hemophilia patients, they're often young boys that grow into men, but you start as a child. And many of these patients have to take factor VIII on a daily basis, or now they've got long-acting factor where maybe every 3 days they would take an infusion of factor. And if you grow resistant to factor, you go on bypassing agents. But these are things that you're administering daily, or if you're lucky, maybe every 2 to 3 days. And we developed a therapy with our colleagues at Chugai that would allow a patient to only take an infusion once every 28 days. And this is a big deal. It's a big deal for small kids. It's a big deal for somebody going off to college. You don't want to be infusing yourself with your new roommate in the room every day.
Yeah.
And so it was really a game-changing therapy. But if you grew up taking these agents and somebody says, trust us, don't take this therapy, you don't need, or take our therapy and you don't need to take anything else for 28 days, that's really scary, because if you bump into something, you could potentially bleed to death. And so looking at the development of a novel therapy that had no endpoints for something that would be a 28-day, that would work for 28 days, and then asking patients and physicians to trust us. There was a lot that went into that, but we had such an amazing team. And now I look at that product and what it's done for patients. And we had patients in the clinical trial that for the first time rode a roller coaster. And so there was so much profound impact for patients with hemophilia, but there was a lot of learnings along the way. And those learnings of not looking at everything as the same, if that makes sense, what I learned in the past in traditional drug development or traditional commercialization is going to work in the future, has been really helpful as I went on to roles in Foundation Medicine or even here at Kite.
Oh, speaking of working with teams, you're also a board member at Freenome as well as a board member at Aspen Neurosciences. And I wanted to just quickly talk about this. Maybe you could tell me, Cindy, what your kind of objectives are as a board member, and if there's a specific skill or talent that people are kind of go to you for as a board member, when there's something comes up.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. In fact, I'm no longer on the board at Freenome, but I am on
Okay.
Aspen Neurosciences. But similarly, I would say both boards were great boards. They were diverse and everybody was bringing something different to the table. The Aspen board is no different, right? They've got a really strong board members, everything from investors to people who bring scientific expertise or very specific things. And I think that the piece that I've enjoyed bringing to the board, as well as learning from my peers, is this idea of how do you take a product, particularly with Aspen, it's a cell therapy product, and how do you scale it? And how do you scale it through development? How do you scale it both from a manufacturing and commercial standpoint? And so those are things that I brought to both on the Freenome side because of my foundation medicine experience, and now on the Aspen Neurosciences side, which is how do you think about scaling pivotal trials? How do you think about gearing up for a launch? And how do you think about scaling globally?
Well, scaling cell therapy manufacturing, I would assume that you are probably highly sought out, for anyone who is an expert in how to do that well. It would be in demand, I would think. So that makes sense. But I also want to ask about one other team of sorts that you're a member of, which is the Biotech CEO Sisterhood. I saw the photo. I was at JP Morgan in San
Oh,
Francisco
great.
last
You
week.
wear pink?
I couldn't make it out, unfortunately, to the biotech CEO Pink Out, the sisterhood meeting in Union Square. But I saw the photo, and it looks like the organization's really expanding. I wonder if you could just take a minute, Cindy, for the Business of Biotech listeners to kind of explain what that organization is and what its mission is.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So I would say I got to work with a number of amazing women through my career. And in early in my career, there weren't a lot of females in science. And so getting to connect with each other is really important. It became important when I was a scientist. It certainly became important when I went into industry. And sometimes you'd almost seek each other out. So you could see maybe somebody who looked like you and sort of had similar experiences. And I think the piece that the Biotech CEO Sisterhood did is formalize that. And so two of the members, Sheila Goose-Raji, who's one of the founding members, and I worked together at Genentech. In fact, when I
Okay.
was running Avastin, she replaced me. When I moved to Europe, she took over Avastin. But these are women who have a variety of different backgrounds and experiences, and coming together and finding ways that we can learn from each other, share learning, share mistakes, share challenges, share opportunities, and support each other in our development is something that is now, by doing this, has now become even more formalized. And it was the type of thing that maybe you got together in the past over a glass of wine, or you'd meet for lunch and do different things. And now we have a chance to really have concerted learnings and share experiences with each other. Everything from development to fundraising to running companies to how to be a great mom and a leader. And those aren't things you necessarily talk about day to day at work. So I think having this experience has been fantastic.
So it's formalized in the sense that you can kind of reach out, or I mean, are there scheduled, meetings or
There are.
like calls regularly, and it's just do you have an agenda of specific things sorry, I'm just curious
No,
about this
great. Thank you for
organization,
asking this
yeah, how does it
question.
work? Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. So yes, you can call each other informally, and many of us do on a regular basis. I would say we have a summit every year where we tackle important topics, and they could be things like, if I think about last year, how do you do fundraising most effectively in a difficult market? The markets haven't been exactly where we wanted them to be, and so having an opportunity to share with each other and support with an agenda that we all put together. We ask each other, what's most important to you? What should we be talking about? And sort of codify the agenda in that way. There's also chances when we're at places like ASCO or JP Morgan or many events that we can all get together as a group, and we tend to find opportunities like you saw at JP Morgan to come together. And then the last thing I'd say is I run the Women at Gilead ERG group here, and I had a chance to invite Sheila in. The Women at Gilead invited Sheila to come speak to us and two other women CEOs to talk to all of the women between Gilead and Kite that wanted to come hear about it. In fact, what I'd say is we had 20% of the attendees were men, and just talking about what it takes to be a CEO, what it takes to rise up in leadership, what were their experiences. And so there's a variety of ways that we get together and support each other.
Thank you for that background on the Biotech Sisterhood CEOs. I think, like I said, it's a really interesting organization, and I'm glad you're a part of it. You joined Kite in 2023. What were the circumstances behind that move, and what in particular made you want to join Kite?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one is when I think about what's your next career move, I'm always thinking about it from a personal, professional journey. What do you need at that point in your life personally, and what's going to help you grow professionally? And I would say joining Kite, I had worked with Dan O'Day, who's the CEO at Gilead, for many, many years. In fact, I think I knew him before we actually worked together when we were both in Europe. And he's a tremendous leader. So I think for me, it starts with working with or for somebody that I have a lot of respect for, that I can learn from. And Dan was definitely a great draw for me coming to Kite. I think the second thing that brought me to Kite, and I have been watching Kite very closely to the point that when I was at Roche and Genentech, we also were interested in Kite, and Gilead sort of closed the deal. So Kite is a company that I've looked at because of the curative potential of cell therapy. Yeah. And there's few companies that you work for that are not afraid to cure patients. Genentech was certainly one of them. And Gilead's exactly like that. And so is Kite, right? Gilead has had the chance to cure HCV. We are on a road to cure HIV as well and end the epidemic. But then you look at what cell therapy has done for patients with lymphoma, what we're seeing in the myeloma data today, being able to join a company that has so much promise, such great science. And, after getting here, finding out what an amazing group of dedicated employees we have at Kite. So I think it's a combination of leadership as well as the mission and what we're doing for patients.
I wanted to ask about how Kite fits into the larger company, Gilead. I wonder if you could just describe, the kind of executive hierarchy and how Gilead supports Kite, how the companies work together.
Sure. So, when Dan came into Gilead, he recognized quickly that Kite's different, and cell therapy is truly different, all the way down to the manufacturing, if that makes sense. It's not sort of a plug and play model into a traditional pharma company. And so at that point in time, long before I was here, he made a decision to keep Kite separate. And then when I came in and talking with Dan, and lessons I learned at Foundation Medicine, because it was a similar model, and I was working with
part of Roche, right? Yeah.
Was that integrating G&A functions really help. It keeps connectivity between the two companies. You have different reporting systems financially that can make it difficult if you're not working on the same systems. And so prior to my coming in, we agreed that we would integrate the G&A functions. And I think that was something that was really welcomed by the Gilead team and by the Kite team. And it's allowed the communication channels to open up even more, because we're physically in different locations. At the time, we were, LA versus San Francisco. We've since now, we occupy a portion of the Gilead campus with our research team now too. But Dan is an incredibly empowering leader, and he allows for independent thinking and decision making. But I also know to be successful as a company and to grow in our ambitions at Gilead and Kite in oncology and inflammation and HIV, frankly, the more we work together, the better it's going to be for everybody and for patients. So I sit on the GLT, which is the Gilead leadership team or executive team, and my peers are the heads at Gilead. So we work very closely together. We spend a lot of time together, and it's been great bringing the two companies closer together and allowed us to really think about our go-forward portfolio and how we can find not just synergies, but how we can build off of some foundational assets that we have in our portfolio, like Yescarta, like Anito-cel. And so we operate independently. We are together from a G&A function, but we do a lot of things together, including strategy.
Yeah, and I would imagine that that consolidating the G&A function, I mean, it at the very least reduces a lot of administrative burden and kind of frees you up to
Yeah,
do the things
yeah,
that you really want to focus on.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, Kite is currently conducting three phase three trials, two, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, two label expansions of the
Mhm.
previously approved B-cell and follicular lymphoma treatment, yes, CARTA. And then you've got a third phase three trial for relapsed refractory multiple myeloma patients. That's with a different CAR T cell therapy, and that one I believe is in collaboration with Arcellx or
That's correct.
Arcellx. Is that right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay. Um, can you talk a little bit, Cindy, about what a launch prep looks like, for cell therapy, maybe, in the context of a more traditional small molecule or now monoclonal antibody launch?
Sure. No, I'm happy to. And as you know, we're gearing up for the Anito-cel launch, which is the collaboration um, with Arcellx of the product in multiple myeloma. And I think, if I think about the differences and what I was saying, sometimes you have to get rid of all the things you know because it's not going to help you for the future and think about things differently. Cell therapies today are delivered in authorized treatment centers around the globe. So we have to go in, authorize the treatment center. There's accreditations that go along with it that are independent bodies. And so you can't just push these medicines out today. I think there'll be a future where you can in a widespread way to every community practice. These are systems that know how to deliver cell therapy. So for Anito-cel, we're gearing up right now. The nice part about Anito-cel versus when we launched Yescarta is today we have an established footprint. So
Yeah.
around the globe, we have over 570 authorized treatment centers. Just in the US alone, we're approaching 180 treatment centers. And we grow that number in the US, I'll say, by about 20 to 25 new treatment centers a year. So part of it is making sure you've got the global footprint and you're able to deliver your therapy. Importantly, though, and we've all learned this in cell therapy, you have to also be able to manufacture the therapy.
Yeah.
And that's something that Kite is just extraordinary at. I've learned so much while I'm here, and we have such committed colleagues in both the research, process development, and our network, as well as our manufacturing network. And so we're gearing up right now to launch in the U.S. With a goal to launch ex-U.S. as well. So we did a tech transfer and moved the Anito-cel product into our Maryland facility. So we went from using a CRO where it was taking 40 to 50 days to get the product to each patient on the clinical trial to really being in line with our current manufactured products, Yescarta and Tecarta. So we have a turnaround time today of between 15 and 17 days, depending on where you're shipping around the globe. Our product is 96% reliability. It means 96% of the patients that send their cells in, we send a product back on the first run. Sometimes it will take two, but it's a very small percentage. And if I look at the competitors in the market today, the turnaround times are 30 to 40 days. The reliability is around 80%. And these are patients that have cancer and need a treatment right away. So we are excited as we're gearing up for this launch together with Arcellx about what we're going to be able to provide for patients globally. And then if you look at the product itself, the efficacy is phenomenal, where you're seeing, 96% of patients having a response. You're seeing very high minimal residual disease, meaning they have no detectable disease. 95% of those patients do. And we have no neurotoxicities, which is something that some of the competitive products have, where you can actually get a great therapy, but in the process of that, develop something like a Parkinson's syndrome or Guillain-Barré. And so we're excited about the safety profile. We're excited about the efficacy and what we're going to do for patients with our global manufacturing.
On the patient access piece, and you just mentioned a minute ago a future where any patient would be able to access these therapies. Is that I guess how do you get there? Is it building, just taking the U.S. for example, is it simply expanding beyond 180 sites to cover the full geography, or is there a different kind of like step change for access that you anticipate happening?
I'll call it a step change. And from my previous life where I was doing T-cell engagers, we had something similar because those products were being administered in a hospital setting for the first 2 days in a step-up dosing, and then patients were going home. So there's a lot of learnings from that. And what we're seeing today with therapies like anito-cel, where the safety profile is quite pristine, these are therapies that can be delivered in a community setting or an outpatient setting. So as I look at the next generation of cell therapies, I think we've all made improvements to enable that. So everything we're doing in our research portfolio has the lens of this needs to be an outpatient therapy that can be administered in the community. And so it's not just about opening up the community centers. There's a lot that we have done with FACT, which is the accrediting body over the course of last year to get accreditation for community practices, and they released that at ASH this year. So there's a stepwise approach that we're taking, but we're seeing it start to unlock the system. So it's a combination of a therapy that safely can be delivered in an outpatient setting, coupled with removing some of the access hurdles I just talked about.
Got it. Great. I wanted to ask a follow-up as well on Arcellx and your collaboration with that company. And I'm just curious, kind of how you share responsibilities for anito-cel, kind of who does what and how that collaboration works in practice.
Yeah, so we have a really great collaboration with Arcellx. I can't say enough good things. It's a strong partnership. And the nice part about collaborating with small companies is that you each bring something different. And the pieces that Arcellx brought to this is a stellar innovation that I just talked about that has a really heavily differentiated safety and efficacy profile. And then there's things that Kite brings to the table, which is how do you scale? Some of the things we talked about earlier, which is how do we bring this product into global development and run global phase 3 studies, work with regulators around the globe? How do we have a global footprint that we can commercialize on? And of course, our industry leading manufacturing. And all of that together is allowing us to take this great innovation from Arcellx and scale it to patients. Today, the way the contract is structured, we co-promote in the US. So you'll see us come out to launch together in the second half of this year. And then the rest of the world we handle because Kite is embedded throughout around the globe through the Gilead affiliates. And we have global development capabilities as well as global manufacturing capabilities.
Excellent. And I'll just mention as a side note to Business of Biotech listeners, if you want to learn more about Arcellx, we did have their CEO on the show. It's been a couple of years now, but check that out if you're interested. Coming back to cell therapy manufacturing and scale, you've talked to Cindy, you've worked in, monoclonal antibodies, you worked at Foundation Medicine and genotyping, both of which at the time were newish at the very least, and you had to work with scaling those, new technologies as well. And I wonder how cell therapy manufacturing and scale today kind of compares maybe with the early days of manufacturing monoclonal antibodies, maybe as an example.
Yeah, no, it's a great example that we use a lot of times, in particular with our own employees or with investors. And I was at Genentech and Chiron in the early days where everyone was trying to figure out how to scale a monoclonal antibody. There weren't things like 20,000 liter reactors, and there weren't necessarily all of these things set up. We're in the same boat, and there's a lot of learnings we can take from what folks did when they were scaling manufacturing of antibodies. And I think about now how companies do that is they have usually a global footprint, maybe a manufacturing facility in Europe, one in the US, maybe one other in Asia, and they're able to serve that whole community. This is no different. We've put in 3 manufacturing facilities, one here in Los Angeles that allows us to serve Asia as well as the western part of the US. We have one in Maryland that serves the eastern part of the US, and we have one in Europe that allows us, we're also serving Latin America, and the one in Europe allows us to scale nicely through Europe and the Middle East. And that's a lot of the learnings, honestly, from how people set up monoclonal antibody production facilities.
What would you say is the most difficult piece of scaling up a cell therapy for, late stage clinical trials and then ultimately commercialization? Is there a kind of singular piece or a handful of issues that, not just Kite, but the cell therapy development sector in total is dealing with or struggling with?
Yeah, there's this healthy tension, Ben, between in research, you want to keep agility. So you're looking at things, and I'll use our portfolio today as an example. Today's first generation cell therapies go after one target often. They're not dual targeted. They may not have decoys or armoring on them, but our next generation all have those things. And so on the research side, you've got to keep this agility to keep iterating. And we've done this nicely in collaborations with groups like Penn, where we were testing a GBM construct and we realized, hey, it's not hanging around in the brain long enough. We're going to bring it back in and we're going to armor it and put it back into patients. There's a level of agility that goes with development of that construct. But then at some point, in order to scale, you've got to lock down. And it's that tension of knowing when to lock down. And different companies approach it differently. I think Kite has had some amazing learnings and they're exceptionally good at it, but we still have tensions, right? We have our process development team saying, you've got to lock that. I'm not going to be able to get it to clinical trials unless it's locked. And our research team thinking, hey, I just want to tinker a little bit and put one more thing on. And it's something that we work closely together to figure out when it is that time.
What about acquisition strategy as it pertains to manufacturing? Kite has made some purchases in Interius Biotherapeutics, T-Immunity. There's also a Pregene deal in China I wanted to ask you about. But what can you say about how acquisitions, play a role in terms of scaling manufacturing or doing different kinds of manufacturing?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. We were just talking about the glioblastoma construct that we created. That was with T-Immunity, right? The acquisition of bringing T-Immunity in allowed us to start our foray into solid tumors. So that was a really critical acquisition. And we got some amazing talent, this tight collaboration with Penn, and it's really allowed us to start exploring a number of different solid tumors. And when I look at, Interius, we have been watching the landscape and realizing allo, which could be off the shelf, just really hasn't had the impact everybody thought it would. But the early in vivo data looks really incredible, really promising. And so we knew we wanted to play in the in vivo space. There's two ways to play there. There's integrating and there's non-integrating, and we're going to play in both. We're going to make sure that we place both bets. But for an off-the-shelf product, the Interius acquisition, what we got was a great team, people who are really deep in vector manufacturing and really strong IP. And the way they created their vector is in a modular way, so we can insert new binders, we can move things around really easily, and we really like that technology. And so as we look at what we can do internally versus what we want to acquire externally, we're always taking that into account. We just didn't have the level of deep vector manufacturing for in vivo type technologies. And so that was a really important deal for us to bring in-house. But we coupled that with, look, we're all watching China, and China has just been amazing. Innovation out of China has been rapidly developing over the last 5 years. And they're really creating these meaningful opportunities for companies like Kite or Gilead to enter partnerships. And so as part of the Interius acquisition, in parallel, we did a strategic collaboration with Pregene. And the Pregene deal has been fantastic because it allows us to rapidly iterate and create in vivo constructs and then work with the Pregene team to test these very quickly in China, where the regulatory environment's just different. They
Faster, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic. And so when I think about those pieces coming together, we feel really confident on the in vivo, on the integrating in vivo space. We're going to be able to move a number of in vivo constructs into patients in the next 2 years.
Excellent. I think most listeners of Business of Biotech will know the difference between allogeneic cell therapies and autologous cell therapies. Allogeneic being the off-the-shelf, the cell therapy is not from the end patient receiving the treatment, whereas autologous is cells extracted, manipulated, engineered, reinserted into the patient. I have to ask, I too thought that allogeneic was going to be the thing, because you mentioned that it hasn't so far worked out that way. Do you have a thought about why that is?
Yeah, it's interesting. So you need, what we're discovering is for autologous, obviously it's personalized, but it needs to get deep into the tissue to be effective. And when it's not, if it's not from your body, if that makes sense, there's often a number of factors that can impact its ability to have that level of efficacy. Now, the interesting part about allo, and I think we're all watching closely for this, is to see if it can play a role in the autoimmune space. Is that the type of disease versus cancer or malignancies where it can really play a deep role. So some of those trials will be reading, some data has come out, early data, but those trials should be reading out. And that's something that we continue to watch closely. But what we saw with in vivo is you saw really autologous-like impact for patients. Those first 6 BCMA patients that were published in the Lancet, that was profound. And Pregene actually ran that trial. And it's the first time I've seen something autologous-like. We've been looking for that in allo and haven't seen it.
It's an interesting time for cell therapy development, kind of following a previous downturn in investor sentiment. First, is that part improving? Do you have a sense of, and you're not now as part of Gilead as beholden as, a startup cell therapy biotech might be, but yeah, it still matters, right? But do you have a sense of kind of where that sentiment sits right now with respect to, broadly cell therapy?
Yeah, it's a great question coming out of JP Morgan as well, because it was a good chance to pressure test that. In addition to meeting some really great small companies, it was good to hear investor sentiment. So, there was a lot published when Takeda, as an example, made a conscious choice to move out of the cell therapy business. But at the same time, some of these players were moving out of the business. You saw AstraZeneca and AbbVie moving in full steam ahead, right?
With Capstan Therapeutics and in the case of AstraZeneca, SO Biotech, both billion-dollar acquisitions. Yeah,
exactly. And so I think, the thing that I've learned from being in the cell therapy business is it does take a fair amount of investment to put in global manufacturing and to integrate your own vector manufacturing. And so there's investments that you have to be willing to make. And if you're a small company, it's going to be really difficult to make those size of investments. And honestly, Kite wasn't able to do it to the scale we have until Gilead acquired us. And so when I think about it, we've got these great innovation engines. Arcellx is a great example of that too, where you've got these small companies that are creating novel therapeutics, and at some point having them come together with larger pharma who can make the important investments necessary to scale this technology. I think that's what we're going to see more of in the future.
Do you think that a startup cell therapy company or even early to mid-stage cell therapy company kind of has to partner with a large company when they get into late stage and launch? Is that, in order to just be able to scale the manufacturing, I guess, as a primary concern? Is it possible? I mean, sure, someone could invest, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in a company and maybe they could do it. But as a general rule, do you think that part is necessary?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've talked to Rami, who's the CEO at Arcellx that you were referencing earlier, about this. Lonza, Wuxi, there's a number of people doing the manufacturing today, but it's not their sole business. So their turnaround times aren't great. Their reliability isn't great. And I think if you really want to see a product that's going to reach the masses around the globe, it probably will require partnership. However, I want to say that there's contract manufacturers, there's certainly CROs now that have a lot of experience in development of cell therapy. So I think you can get to a certain point. But when it comes to commercialization, footprint, all of those things, today it's going to require a partner. And that could change over time.
The current FDA administration seems to be pretty supportive of cell and gene therapies in general. They most recently, at the beginning of JP Morgan, announced a more flexible approach for development, commercialization, and process validation. Well, what do you make of that? I guess speaking specifically about this most recent announcement, does that benefit Kite directly?
It does. And I think the piece I'd say that I've been impressed with the agency, and particularly Marty McRae, is he's really interested in hearing from people, right? He did these listening sessions with CEOs, and I was lucky enough to attend one of them. He understands regenerative therapies are different. He's really thinking with his team about how to make the FDA more competitive. And so you think about the regulatory environment in somewhere like China, we just talked about. Australia is another great example of a regulatory environment that allows you to move regenerative products into phase 1 more rapidly than you do in the US. And so what I've seen is a real interest in moving in that direction. And some of these new guidances that you're seeing come out, I think are an example of they're taking this very seriously and saying, how can we make the US as competitive as some other countries as it relates to development, but also recognizing the value of curative therapies, and that these, cell therapy is very different. And the paradigm that it offers in lymphoma is patients to have the potential chance at cure. And I think they take that very seriously.
In comparison with markets like China or Australia, when you think about, the speed at which you can get, into trials with patients, is there something you would like to see happen that hasn't yet in the US that could, perhaps move us closer to parity with some of these other markets?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the IND and being able to move these therapies into patients more quickly. And a lot of the steps that they're taking around process validation changes and things like that are enabling it. But I think it's a stepwise approach, and I think we're going to need to see maybe larger steps in the future. But everything that they're showing is that they're moving in that direction.
Yeah. Excellent. We are coming up on the end of our time, Cindy. This it's flown by, but I wanted to ask you about your primary goals for 2026 before we sign off, and maybe what some of the biggest challenges or uncertainties are that you anticipate this year.
Oh, thanks for that. So 2026, we're really looking forward to. So we have two marketed products, as you know, Yescarta and Tecartus, and we're continuing to provide those to patients around the globe, and that won't change. I think the piece that's coming in is we have a launch the second half of the year for our multiple myeloma therapy. So a lot of Kite is gearing up towards that for the US launch. And we're also rapidly advancing our portfolio. We shared a lot of great data at ASH. We have next generation lymphoma product that would replace Yescarta and Tecartus. And we are starting a head-to-head trial of that product, Kite 753, against Yescarta. So we feel confident enough in our next generation products that we can beat the first generation of cell therapies. So our focus is really continue to provide our amazing medicines to patients, have a successful launch with anito-cel, and continue to advance our portfolio.
Oh, you've touched on an old hobby horse of mine, Cindy, the need for head-to-head trials. I'm glad to hear that you're doing that. That's fantastic. I really appreciate you being here and coming on the show. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I really enjoyed it.
We've been speaking with Cindy Perettie, EVP and Global Head at Kite Pharma. I'm Ben Comer, and you've just listened to the Business of Biotech. Find us and subscribe anywhere you listen to podcasts, and be sure to check out new weekly videocasts of these conversations every Monday under the Business of Biotech tab at lifescienceleader.com. We'll see you next week, and thanks as always for listening.